Okay, we're looking at the New Testament overview and the history and geography of the Bible, and we begin by thinking about the fact that the Roman Empire was prophesied to be in place. You go back to the book of Daniel, chapter 2, and verses 44 and 45, it says, "In the days of these kings," that is the fourth kingdom of that great image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen, "the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, the interpretation is sure." And so what we had noted before is God's overriding hand in the affairs of men, raising men up, taking them down as kings, as rulers, raising up nations, taking nations down, and bringing all of this about to set the world up for the coming and the establishment of His kingdom. Things like the Greek culture and the Greek language being spread throughout that former Persian Empire. And then the Rome coming in and dominating the Mediterranean world, then establishing the roads and giving a measure of peace, security, safety, certain laws that were in place that helped in the establishment and the spread of Christianity, at least initially. But you see all of that, and you see that it was the expectation of the people. If you go to Luke chapter 3, and notice verse 15 here. Luke 3, verse 15. If I could get someone to read that for us. Go ahead, John.
"As the people were in expectation, and all were questioning their hearts concerning John, whether he might be the Christ."
Okay. So the people, they understood from the prophecies, they understood that they were in that time period when the Lord would establish His kingdom. And you see that expectation carry on through to the disciples, of course, understanding about Jesus being the Christ. They still had a misconception just before He ascended into heaven about the kingdom being established, but it's the idea that the people understood these prophecies and they were waiting on that kingdom, thinking it's going to come at any time now. And Jesus, of course, has to clarify for them and teach them about the spiritual nature of that kingdom. However, it is the idea that He would establish His kingdom. It would be an indestructible kingdom that would consume all others. That was a promise from the Lord. Now, the Roman Empire dominated during this time, as we noted. And in Luke 2, we can turn over there. We'll look there in just a moment. But nations. What nations come up in the New Testament as you think about this? What nations are around in the New Testament? What do we read about? What do we come across as we read through the New Testament besides Rome? Egypt. What else? Any others? And I don't mean the Acts 2 list. I mean just ones where things are actually happening. Okay, Ethiopia comes up. The Ethiopian returns down there. He's come from there. He's returning there. So you got Egypt and Africa, Ethiopia being in Africa, so the African continent.
Greece.
Okay, Greece, which is where? Up there? Europe, right? It's over in Europe. So you've got Greece that is particularly talked about. You have Corinth and Athens, places like that. Of course, Asia Minor is a region, but you've got the area of Galatia, the Galatian churches up there, the province of Galatia. You have Macedonia that's talked about, right? Macedonian call. You have Syria that's in there, and Syria was a Roman province, and Judea was a sub-province within the greater Syrian province. But it's the idea that there are a lot of different nations that are mentioned in here, a lot of different localities where the events of the New Testament unfold, and it behooves us to know a little bit about them. It helps us to understand maybe why some things unfolded the way that they did. But we think about that greater Mediterranean world. Of course, this is a modern shot of that. Most of the New Testament took place right in here, or a good portion of the New Testament took place right in here with the event or the gospel accounts with John, with Jesus, with the disciples here. The beginning of the book of Acts, a lot of it took place within Israel and Syria, up to the north, Damascus, things like that. And then, of course, Asia Minor and Europe. And Asia Minor, of course, is what today? It's Turkey. Okay, so you got Turkey, you got Greece, things unfolding there. So think about the Rome and how dominant it was in the first century. What can you think of concerning Rome that just pops up throughout the New Testament?
When I think of Rome, I think of Jesus being crucified on the cross, but the Roman government, the government used that as a worst of the worst offenders got that on the cross.
Okay.
I think about Rome as a dominant control, a force, strong government, political control over the region, and of course they were strong economically as well because they occupied all the regions of commerce around the greater Mediterranean area.
Okay.
So a very powerful nation in every aspect.
Okay. Let's read Luke 2, verses 1 through 7. Luke 2, 1 through 7. And it helps set the scene for us. Luke 2, 1 through 7. Who's got that for us? Go ahead, Clint.
In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, and to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, and was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in the manger, because there was no place for them in the inn.
All right. So the Christ child coming into the world comes into the world, and Luke sets the context. Here's what the world looked like at that time. Here's what was going on. Here's why he ended up being born in Bethlehem versus being born in Nazareth. So it talks about this Caesar Augustus and this Quirinius governing Syria, or governor of Syria there. The census being put out. So you got a lot of different layers about Rome here. And of course, remember, Rome, it started a few centuries before, of course, as a republic, developed over time. It grew in power, it extended that power. Particularly, I think most of us are familiar with either Pompey or Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, really probably the more famous, and extending the power. And then, of course, Octavian, or as it says here, Augustus Caesar, taking control, being the first true emperor, recognized as the emperor, and exercising that control. And here is talking about that he is sitting in that position of an emperor. What is, or what was, an emperor? Mike?
I guess I was looking more as a supreme leader who, basically said this is the direction of the empire.
Okay.
I think emperors were typically considered to be gods, or from the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them actually, in some cultures, were considered to actually be divine.
Yes, and that's one of the issues. And it wasn't so much an issue with Augustus, although he has that title of Augustus. But there are later emperors who basically insisted. Now, some would accept or just sort of turn a blind eye to this deification of themselves. But then others insisted on that, and that's where you get into the book of Revelation, and it becomes a very real problem for Christians of being pressured to worship a man, an emperor that's sitting up on the throne. But you have Caesar Augustus, you have Tiberius Caesar that's mentioned later in the New Testament, Luke 3, verse 1. But he is the supreme ruler, and he has military, judicial, administrative powers within the Roman government. And so it helps us especially to understand, as I said, in the book of Revelation, the problem and the struggle and the power between the Roman government and the Christians, and what they could and could not do, and then what they faced, and how terrible it was, because you had these men who were essentially dictators, even though they had the form of a Senate. And, it's supposed to be of the people, and the Senate's supposed to choose the emperor and things like that. But that's not really how it happened. So you've got an emperor here, and then you have within the power structure a man by the name or titled a proconsul. So if you go to Acts chapter 13, probably the one we're most familiar with. In Acts 13, we won't read this whole account, but remember it says, let's read verses 6 and 7. 6 and 7. Who will get Acts 13, 6 and 7 for us? Go ahead, Hank.
Now, when they had gone to the island of Palos, they found a certain sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew named Barnabas, who with proconsul served all of us in Telegram. This man called for Barnabas and Saul to hear for the word of God.
Okay, so this proconsul Sergius Paulus, what is a proconsul? I'll just throw it out there for that. Anybody know what these guys are?
Like a council of life, you would call it.
He was the lead senator of that senatorial area. The consul, basically, was the senator, I believe, and the proconsul.
Well, there were usually two consuls, and if you go back and look at Julius Caesar in particular, there were usually two consuls. He was one, and basically he picked the other, who was his lackey. But he was a consul, and proconsuls were usually former consuls who then went out, and they were of the senatorial rank, as Mike's saying, and they were appointed to govern a particular region by the Senate. It was an extremely powerful, very wealth-generating type of position. A lot of them abuse a position for them selfish purposes. But it tells us that there is a Sergius Paulus, who is an intelligent man, which, by the way, believe it or not, to be a leading politician in that day, you didn't have to be intelligent. You just had to know the right people. But he's an intelligent man, and what is he wanting? He wants to hear the word. What does that tell you?
That he had heard about it already.
He's curious about it. Yeah.
I think there's a shift of interest in the Word of God at that time, specifically to the higher ranking officials.
Okay. Not everybody in an elite position is locked into their beliefs, their, paganism, whatever, which would have been we need to understand, a huge influence in gaining power and moving up and getting things done in Rome. But this man says, you know what, I want to hear about this. I want to learn. And as you go down through, it says in verse 12, then the proconsul believed. So he came to be a believer in Jesus Christ, which is amazing that a man of that rank and power, even though Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, not many mighty, not many noble. Well, that means a few This is a few of them here. So you think about this, and this isn't an exact like from the top down in the Roman Empire. I just have various things listed that are mentioned in the New Testament here. But it's amazing that a man of this rank, of this power, this would be sort of like if somebody was a Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader or something like that, that would hear the gospel and believe that gospel, become a follower of Christ. It would stun us that would happen. So you've got this proconsul here, and then you have the rank of governor that was mentioned just a little while ago. If you go back to Matthew chapter 27, just want to make note of the most famous governor, I think, perhaps, in the New Testament. Matthew 27, verses 1 and 2. Who's got that for us? Go ahead, Jim.
When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor.
Okay, so it says he's a governor. They're also known as prefects or procurators, but a governor who, and here, Pilate is the governor of Judea. Judea, again, is a sub-province of that Syrian province. Basically, you just think of the area of the Eastern Mediterranean. If you just follow that out east, it's the whole Syrian province here. But he's a governor within that province. And what was the responsibility and duties of a governor? And why would they have a governor over the whole province, but then another governor over Judea? So, Mike?
Noted that he exacted Roman law, make sure that Roman law was exacted up throughout. That they collected taxes. I think they commanded troops also, as far as like the National Guard.
Right. And that's the thing about, generally speaking, the law enforcement in Rome was the military. They basically are the guys who took care of business. Now, there are some things like you could see up in Philippi when Paul and Silas are arrested. It talks about that the magistrates there, that they had these lictors who enforced it, and they were usually retired military guys. But it's essentially the military that's taking care of things. And Pilate here has command of troops. He orders them to do various things. He leans them out to the Jews who set a guard at the tomb, remember, at the end of Matthew 27, and then they bribed the guards to say, or these soldiers to go back to Pilate and say his disciples stole the body, and we'll make things right with him if, he begins to get upset about that. So we'll fix all of that. But it's a governor who has almost his own little kingdom here. He had a lot of power, but he was answerable to the emperor, and his main job, and particularly at this time in Judea, as it would always be in Judea, keep peace. Stop these Jews from causing problems. That was his main, and that's when you see Jesus on trial, that's the pressure that's being brought to bear on him. We're going to cause you a problem if you don't do what we want you to do. And that's why he eventually really caves in. John, did you have something?
Well, that Luke, to those first verses that we read, there's a lot of information in there. You mentioned Rome was surviving on taxing the empire. So, he put out a decree that you had to go register. Well, why did they have to register? It's probably so that they would know exactly what the population was, so they knew exactly how much taxes they could collect. So the method that they used was you had to go back to your hometown or your ancestral hometown and register. Well, Joseph was from Bethlehem. They were living in Galilee, in Nazareth, so they had to go 90-some miles to Bethlehem, which was prophesied as the birthplace of the Christ, and register. So they made that trip. Mary was pregnant, and they made that trip up there. But the geopolitical happenings of the day not miraculously fulfilled the prophecy of God. Just God's providence is at work at all times. We have no idea why, but he used these evil powers of men to facilitate his wishes to come about.
So about 400 years before, God knew that the Roman Empire would rise up. He knew that they would be conducting a census and sending people to their ancestral homes, and that's how Jesus ends up being born in Bethlehem. Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So you've got this government that's well established. It exercises firm control over these areas through the proconsuls, through the governors. Felix and Festus, by the way, are governors as well. Then they have something called a tetrarch, which is slightly different within it. And Herod Antipas was a tetrarch. Luke 3 verse 1 also mentions Philip there, a tetrarch. And then they ruled a region under the Roman official. So they would be under whatever governor, and they would rule a particular area. Herod Antipas sent Jesus back to Pilate because Pilate was over him. In Luke 23, remember, Pilate learns Jesus is from Galilee. He sends him to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. Herod, interviews Jesus. Jesus doesn't say anything to him. He sends him back to Pilate because Herod was under Pilate in the Roman system of authority. Mike?
I think here also, I think what we see through that story in some of their jobs were to take the local customs around. They can keep the local customs, make sure that those local customs actually meet the Roman law and were abided by those laws.
So it would have to be in alignment with it when it came into conflict. That's when they...
That's why that back and forth started to happen.
Yeah, they hammer down on it. So then you also have in the New Testament these guys who are kings. But wait a second. There's an emperor. Isn't he like a king? Why would there be other kings? Well, these are really like mini kings, if you will. King of a region or whatnot. Can you think of a king that's mentioned in the New Testament? Let's go to Acts 12. Acts chapter 12 and verse 1. Acts 12 verse 1. Go ahead, Carter.
Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church.
Okay. Herod the king. Who is this guy? I don't want a deep detail because we'll get to Herod's, like the whole thing later. Big picture, I guess. But when it says Herod the king, what's he king of?
He's over that local area. The Romans had their friends that were local people, and that family had gone to Rome and had befriended Caesars and different people, but they were basically descendants of Esau, Edomites, that were hated by the Jews.
Yes, but they on the surface adopted Jewish religion and traditions and things like that to placate the Jews, but they were evil and wicked men. You can see that there in Luke chapter 23. You can see it here in Acts chapter 12 as he's going after the disciples. He's doing it to please the Jews, not out of any personal religious convictions about, hey, these guys are crazy here, we need to get rid of them. It's just totally a thing to make the Jews happy. So you've got a king here. You have a tribute that's mentioned, and this is getting into the military thing. Claudius Lysias, if you go to Acts chapter 21, there's this man that's named there, which is interesting that Luke would name him. But Acts chapter 21 and verse 31, Acts 21, 31, 23. Let me check here. So they arrest him in 21, that is, they arrest the Apostle Paul. In Acts 23, verse 28, it's talking about what he does. 26, Acts 23, verse 26. This is that tribute, Claudius Lysias, who writes a letter to Governor Felix to explain, here's why I arrested Paul. I really don't know what to do with him. I'm sending him to you for safety. When Paul had to escape because those guys took the oath that they were going to kill him and all of that. So you've got the tribute who is a military commander and leader. There would have been one in Jerusalem, probably one in other larger cities, but they often commanded cohorts of men. That's 480 to 600 men that would be under their charge, soldiers. And their job was strictly to maintain civil order. That's why in Acts 21, when the Jews begin to go berserk about Paul being in the temple and they start to tear him apart, that's why the Roman, this Claudius Lysias, sent troops down there, go in there and put a stop to that. And they clamped down on it very hard. And he was about to scourge Paul. We'll get to that in just a minute. But what other military rank do we read about that really is the one I think we know most about, at least as studying the Bible? Centurion. Who do you think of as a centurion? Okay, Cornelius comes to mind, right? He's named in there. Yeah, there's one at the cross that's mentioned, but then there's a centurion servant who Jesus healed, and he clearly understood authority because he had authority and he was under authority, and he understood that Jesus had authority as well. But Cornelius, in Acts 10, of course, probably the most well-known centurion in the New Testament. What were centurions? Mike?
Military leaders were about 100 men.
Yeah, it would vary from time to time. Just like when you think about a Roman legion, sometimes people want to put a specific number on there, but it varied widely. In legions, generally, if they started out at full recruitment, let's just give it a number of 5,000, 10 years later, after some wars, they might be down to 3,200, but they were still considered a legion, and they didn't replenish their ranks generally unless they got really down. Then sometimes they would combine. But he was within that legionary structure, and he was over about 80 to 100 men or so, maybe a few more at times. But what was his role? Discipline. Very much so discipline. And it was harsh discipline. Soldiers were almost treated like slaves at times. They were beaten and put through very hard times, but it toughened them up as soldiers. But they were also responsible for the training of the men to make sure that they were ready for battle, and they would lead the men in battle. They would be on the front line with them. They would be out there fighting shoulder to shoulder in the heat of things. And so they were very well respected men, very tough men. So when you think about Cornelius, you think about a man who was proven as a soldier, proven as leadership, and he had been through battles, no question about it. And he was one who was very well respected by the people around him. And I think you understand that reading through the account about he had trusted soldiers, he had household servants, and he was a great man. But they were mid-level officers who were really the backbone of the Roman legions, of the Roman army. Any other thoughts on these things, the government positions or military? Ron?
Stephen, overall then, would you describe, or is it correct to describe the Roman government as a military dictatorship?
Very much so, I would say. Very much so. They had the Senate. They kept the Senate almost for appearances. But yes, it was very much highly controlled. Their main thing was the collection of taxes, right? The protection of and expansion of their territory, which would bring in more taxes. But then the stability of the empire. They absolutely wanted things stable. And it wasn't as though life was not good. It was good under the Roman Empire. For the most part, you're talking about, hey, you want to go, you want to work, you want to take care of your family, you want to travel to some place. That was all doable under the Roman system for the most part, because if there were troubles that popped up, if there were bandits, or if somebody was, doing something nefarious, they would sweep in and they would take care of business, harshly sometimes, but they would take care of it, and they would try to settle things down. But we're going to skip forward here and thinking about this, the laws. I want to go back to the laws here, Roman government and military. So some of the laws. Let's go to Acts 19, verse 40. Acts 19, verse 40. In Acts 19, what do we have here? Where's Paul? He's at Ephesus. What happened at Ephesus? The riot. All right, Acts 19, verse 40. Who will read that for us? Acts 19:40. Philip.
We are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering.
Okay, so this is Demetrius causing a problem here. They finally get someone up to speak to calm the crowd down, and he lays it out to them. We have got to shut this down because we're going to be in trouble. Does anyone know why they would be in trouble? And what could potentially happen here? Ephesus was what was considered to be a free city. Basically, you guys can run your things as long as things go smoothly. We'll leave you alone. But in a case like this, where you have the whole town turn out to the stadium for a riot, Rome did not like that, and they get wind of this. And what's going on here, they're apt to send somebody over and say, okay, we're taking control, and we're going to run things now. And you're not going to have the freedoms you had before. Mike?
I think it shows the power of words, because that started because of what Paul said.
Yes.
Everything Paul did for what he said.
And what Demetrius said to get everybody stirred up about this, right? So you have Roman law in place that in this case right here is a good thing to tamp down the rioting of these people who are just completely beside themselves over the paganism and the threat to their pagan idols and the income that came from those idols. Acts 22. So Acts 22. And remember, this is, of course, Paul being arrested in Jerusalem over the mini riot that took place that we mentioned a while ago. In Acts 22, let's read here 23 to 29, just to get a sense of this. Ron?
Then, as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Then the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him.
So what's going on here?
Well, they took charge of Paul, and they wanted to have an understanding of why there was this tumult. And so they bound him, and they were getting ready to scourge him when Paul identified his citizenship. Mm-hmm. And if I understand this correctly, the commander had purchased his citizenship, mm-hmm. but Paul was a natural-born Roman citizen. And so they had no right to do this, as Paul said, without going through the lawful process of determining that he was a condemned man.
Right, exactly right. You have the laws of Rome that were there for the protection of its citizens and to provide stability. And here, Paul is able to use that to keep himself from being scourged. And so this, again, when you look into the New Testament, you've got this mix of things. You see things like even what John was talking about, this Roman laws and functioning of the government and how it unfolded in helping the plan of salvation unfold. And then here it's helping because Paul is being spared this beating. And so it's a good thing, even though we read about there are conflicts in other areas. There are some good things about it to be able to help him to continue to do his work. So you've got the laws protecting and violations. This commander is absolutely on edge right now because he realizes I've already violated Roman law, and if Paul pushed it, I would be in big time trouble. So he backs off, but he keeps him in custody, mainly, I think, for his protection, more so than because he thinks something's wrong with Paul, but he sends him on to the governor because he can't figure out what to do with him later on. Mike?
Since he was born in Tarsus, because it was a free city, like Ephesus, that's how he gained that citizenship. And not everybody from Tarsus would have had this. They come from affluent families who, through the lineage, showed that they were actual Roman citizens, not necessarily just born in a region or anything like that.
Right. And if memory serves me, there's some more detail about the Jews in particular from Tarsus being granted Roman citizenship, but I'll have to check the details on that. We'll hopefully, Lord willing, touch on that later on as well. So what other, and this is Acts 25, we won't read this just for the sake of time, but how else did Paul use his Roman citizenship, his rights, as he went through his trials?
He's the old Caesar rather than being handed over to the local big deal problem.
Exactly. He had the right to appeal to Caesar to go and have his case heard by him as a Roman citizen, so that's what he did. So he used it to his advantage. Mike?
Well, and also, we don't necessarily just read specifically about this, but he had the right to freedom anywhere freedom of movement anywhere inside of the Roman Empire.
Right.
Just had to pay to give him people.
Citizenship had its privileges, and that was, again, you see the providence of God working in that because these laws worked favorably. He could travel far and wide, go and teach and preach the gospel, and then the general peace and stability, the good roads, the shipping, the commerce that's going all over the Mediterranean. They could go from one port to another, and all these things going on that help facilitate the spread of the kingdom.
Yes, and I was thinking of that very thing, Stephen, as well as the level that Paul was able, because of the providence of God, to take it to the highest levels of that government. So you see how far-reaching the implications are with those that knew about these things.
Yes, because remember, the Lord had told him that he would go before kings and governors and present the gospel. He went to the very peak of power in that Roman Empire and presented the gospel to them. John?
I want to contrast one thing. So all this that you're talking about, the Romans and how powerful they are, they're the richest entity on earth. They basically control the whole world, and they have, power over all these regions. Well, how does God introduce His Son and the King of the Church? Well, in the most insignificant town, the most insignificant family have a baby born of a virgin, and nobody knows about it. In the poorest region, in the poorest place in the empire, this takes place. The most powerful king that's ever going to exist comes into the world there. Poor as can be. Well, that's how God operates. When you think about today, you have all the powerful governments of the world. You have all the powerful churches of the world, and the grand cathedrals and the buildings. But where's God's kingdom? It's in a little church in Newton, North Carolina that hardly anybody ever notices. But that's the most powerful organization on this earth to this very day. That's how God operates.
Where's the Roman Empire? It's in the history books. It's in ruins. It's in rubble. Right? That's where the Roman Empire is. The kingdom of God is still alive and active and worldwide. and has worldwide influence and
the
impact.
most powerful entity on
Yes.
this earth, and we're part of it. And if
Exactly.
we ever need to question or feel bad or think, well, why aren't we like those? Well, think about where Christ was born and how he came into being. Nobody in Bethlehem even knew that it was happening.
Mhm.
It was the King of the world that was coming.
Yep, exactly right. Exactly right. So, in Rome, of course, so you've got the government, you've got military, you've got laws there, and of course the religion being paganism. But one of the things to note is that the Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus. He was the top religious guy in all of Rome. And he did that in part because if you go back, some of them did not believe in it. Like Julius Caesar really didn't believe in the gods and everything, but he went through the motions because the people and the troops especially had their gods and believed in those things, and he did it to persuade them. But that's where you get down later in where those Caesars did believe, and they believed they were gods, that they put the pressure upon the Christians to worship them. And so Christianity was born in a world, I think that's hard for us to comprehend how hostile and anti-Christ it really was. It was top to bottom everywhere they went. It was a battle to establish, to proclaim the truth. And it was an oddity among people. It's not in our society to proclaim Christ. So many people believe in him. And I understand the true religion of Jesus Christ is rejected. It's seen as an oddity. But it's not like it was in the first century, a world filled with paganism. All right, so we think about this. We think about the area. This is modern Israel. I think there's a map in the book, maybe page 6 in there, and it shows modern Israel and how you have the occupied West Bank and all of that. Anyway, it's all over in that region of the country. There are various things you could go over. You can see these cities. You can see the ruins of these cities. You can see roads that are still there. You can see buildings that are there, or the foundations of buildings and various things. So it's all over there. I want to just touch briefly on the Jewish sects that existed in the first century, and we'll just take these last few minutes to do this. So one of the sects of the Jews is the Sadducees. Who knows anything about the Sadducees? Who were they?
They were more liberal in their thinking about the scriptures. They didn't believe in the resurrection.
Yeah. In particular, they didn't believe in angel spirits or the resurrection. That's noted in Acts, I think it's 23, with the Apostle Paul being on trial there. Jesus had a run-in with them when they came and asked that question. Well, this man had a wife and he died and no children, and his brother married another brother, and all 7 of them, and whose wife should be in the resurrection. And so they had that conflict. They were aristocratic rulers. They were generally wealthy, and the high priest, at least in the first century, and I think generally speaking, was from that sect of the Sadducees, from the early first century on, when they kind of came to be and had power. They were very political. They disappeared after 70 AD, but they are the priestly caste. When you read about the priests, mostly we're talking about Sadducees, and they dominated the Sanhedrin council as well. Pharisees, who are these guys?
Might say they were the middle class or the upper middle class. They were very influential, and they believed in the oral and the written traditions of the Jews, and they appeared to enforce that.
Right, and their name literally is the idea of separatist or separated. They were the ones who wanted to be strict with the law. Paul had mentioned that he was of the strictest sect of the Pharisees. And so they were very sincere, very diligent, but they were mostly middle-class businessmen. So they had money, but they were regular people. They weren't the aristocrats like the Sadducees. So the Pharisees held the greatest sway among the population of Israel. And they were like an official party that you had to go through certain things to be recognized as an official member of the Sadducees, and they were very diligent in their beliefs and practices. Well, then you also have the scribes and the lawyers. Who are these guys? And they're really a subsect of these others, but scribes and lawyers. What's the scribe's job? Write the law. What's the lawyer's job? To know the law, right? Yeah. So these guys knew the law. That was their occupation. They copied, they studied it, they were supposed to be experts in it. But as Mark 7 talks about, they very much like the Pharisees, but they were tradition keepers, and they created laws to add. They accused Jesus of blasphemy in Mark chapter 2 when he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." So that was that group. Jesus very often had conflicts with the scribes and the lawyers, and he condemned them very blatantly. The Zealots, mentioned in Luke 6, verse 15. Simon the Zealot was one of the apostles. Who are the Zealots?
They were severely anti-Roman. They were kind of looked at as rebels, and part of the separatists, where they didn't want. They thought God was the only ruler that you should have, and anybody else was just.
Okay. The Pharisees were nationalists. The Zealots were hyper-nationalists. They were the guys that were stirred up trouble, that would create unrest in Judea, and were a thorn in the side of the Roman powers and governments that be. Clint.
I think it's interesting. You have Matthew, who's one of the 12.
Pawns of Rome. Right?
And then you have Simon the Zealot. These guys would have hated each other. But instead, they're working with Jesus. So I think that's a pretty neat relationship. You can see
Definitely.
it crosses through that geopolitical barrier.
They have particular beliefs and practices in their life, but they unite together in Christ and follow Him, and everything else is subservient to being His disciple. So just one more, the Herodians. That was a party that was aligned with the Herods for power and favors and political purposes and things like that. They were compromisers, they were sellouts, and they would generally be hated by the Pharisees and pretty much everybody else. But the Herodians very early on wanted to kill Christ. They did not like Him, and they aligned with the others to go against Him and to have Him dispatched, if you will. In Matthew 22, it discusses that. But it's interesting how these parties come together, unite together in order to oppose the Lord. All right, we'll pause there, and Lord willing, pick up in that next lesson, lesson number 2, as it begins the study of Christ.